Hello and welcome to the Alastair Generationally Speaking podcast, where we look at bridging the generation gap by debunking myths, tackling stereotypes, and sharing practical tips on how we can build stronger intergenerational connections. My guest this week is a 21-year-old mental health and digital well-being campaigner. He currently works as campaigns director at FlipGen, a youth-led digital well-being organisation. Today, we're going to be talking about what it's like for Gen Z entering the workplace. We'll talk about mental health across generations and young people in business. So it's a great pleasure today to talk to Paddy Crump. Hi, Paddy.
Hi, Alastair. It's really, really great to be with you. I'm really excited.
Well, there's so much to cover, as we've just discovered. And obviously, really focusing on you, your generation, how you interact with other generations, and also some of the learnings that you can share with us that we can all learn from. But I want to start off by talking a little bit about you, as I do with all of my guests, about your background. What was life growing up? And do you see yourself as a typical Gen Z?
I absolutely don't see myself as a typical Gen Z. My life growing up, I grew up in a little village, surrounded by people who weren't Gen Z, very much very much older, retired people. And so a lot of my upbringing was spent at summer fetes and in pantomimes, in amateur dramatics. So very much I'd kind of describe it as a kind of traditional little village where I grew up talking to people who are retired and learning from them. And now I wouldn't say I'm typical at all. I don't really like clubbing. I've never been on a theme park. I'd much rather be sat down watching Great Pottery Throwdown with my dad on a Sunday evening. And I'm a massive politics and history nerd. So, I've been told quite a few times by various different people that I'm not stereotypical Gen Z.
And what do you put that down to? Yes, you talk about your environment, which makes a big difference. I have this concept called the 5 circles of generational influence. So what makes us? And clearly that rural background, which I can completely relate to because that's how I was brought up too. Although there's a few years in between us, it has to be said. But what about your sort of parents' parenting style? You talked about, being with your dad watching Great Pottery Throwdown and things like that. How hands-on were they? We hear a lot about helicopter parenting these days. So what was that like?
Yeah, I think my parents are very much hands-off, and they never bothered about me going outside, getting dirty, running around in the woods, climbing trees. If I used to go to nursery and the nursery nurses would apologise because my clothes are dirty, they wouldn't mind at all. And I think that had a big impact on me, and maybe because there wasn't many young people in my village, that I spent a lot of time with them and with my family, and we're a very small family. There's only the 4 of us, and I didn't really have any grandparents, so that was part of it. A lot of my weekends were spent mowing the lawn and fixing a tractor and doing this kind of thing. So yeah, I think, and my parents, one of the things I think has really impacted me is that I think speaking to other people my age, it is quite different. If I ever got a school report, my parents would always look at the effort grade rather than the attainment grade. And that had a big influence on my life and who I am today. In terms of that, it was never about being the best. It was about trying and getting out there and giving it a go. And that kind of was similar to getting outside and just giving things a go and playing different sports. So I was always encouraged to do that kind of thing.
And how different, you said you're in a small village community, but obviously then you went to a bigger secondary school. First of all, actually, we should talk about phones and technology and so on. Did you have any restrictions? What age were you when you got your first phone, and how did you start getting on with social media?
Yeah, so I was I got my phone quite late. I got my first iPhone on my I think around when I was my 13th birthday. So I was still carrying a Nokia brick around at secondary school when everybody else had iPhones, which at the time I wasn't best pleased, but now I look back and I'm quite grateful. And I started to use social media, and it did have an impact on me. I remember my dad, one of the things he used to do was read to me, and there were times when if I was having arguments with people, I'd be on my dad's iPad under the covers messaging people, and just being constantly on it while my dad was like reading to me. So from an early age, it was quite a big factor in my life. And then as I grew up at school, there started to be bullying happen on group chats and that kind of thing. Social media didn't really help my mental health. So yeah, there was that the impact. But even though I got my phone quite late compared to other people, I probably was the last person in my year to do it. Quickly became quite a big problem.
And that, judging from what you're saying there, that led you to take a greater interest in mental health and hence FlipGen, which we will get to in a moment, because that's clearly very much your focus of what you do. Just before we get to that and your current work, something that was quite significant when we first spoke was about the fact that you went straight into work after leaving school. And there's, sometimes seen as a huge amount of pressure on youngsters to go to university and get further qualifications and things. Tell me a little bit about what was going through your mind, why you took the path you did.
Yeah, so you mentioned a little bit about my mental health, and I really struggled at school. I didn't really fit in at school. I had a very tough time with people, and my mental health was really bad during COVID and during my sixth form year. So I just wanted to get out of education. So I got out, and there was so much pressure to go to university from my school. I remember chats with the careers advisors, and they were really pushing me to go to school and pushing me to not just go to university, and not just go to university, but go away for university. And it's something that I really didn't want to do. I struggled really bad with depression, and I wasn't in a state where I felt like I could go. So my dad never went to university. My dad's dad never went to university. And so I always had that aspect in my head that, I didn't need to go to university to get where I wanted to be. And despite all that pressure, so it was the fact that I knew that I didn't need to go to university, but also I didn't feel like I confident to go to university at that point. So I decided to kind of explore my options. And also I didn't know what I wanted to do. When I was, up until COVID, I wanted to be a rugby player. And then I realised that wasn't for me, too dangerous. So I was like looking what I wanted to do. And so I didn't have a really clear idea. So I thought I'd work for a bit. I'd see what I wanted to do. I'd maybe go to university in the future. But at this point in time, or at that point in time, it wasn't right for me, because I didn't want to just kind of waste 3 years on something because I felt like I'd pushed into it. And so, yeah, and I think we mentioned parents before. I always had that support. My mum and my dad have always said that it doesn't like bother them at all whether I go to university or not. And because I've had that example of my dad who didn't go to university and has been an inspiration for me. My mum went to university, but I had those two different routes into work. So I never felt in myself that I had that pressure. There was external pressure from school, but I decided that it wasn't for me. And at the point, my mental health, I speak to a counsellor, and at that point, I knew that my mental health would probably be better served not going to university.
And that's an incredibly, realistic position to take that some people don't see. Sometimes the idealism takes over, but for you to be grounded and to be really pragmatic in that way is really impressive. And the thing that really struck me when we first spoke, you talked about your first day in the workplace, and we'll come back to mental health in a while, because it's clearly a very key part of your life and who you are, hence the job that you now do. But just briefly talking about that first day at work, because it really highlighted how the workplace isn't necessarily brilliant at welcoming new people into the environment. So tell us a bit about those first days.
Yeah, I remember them very clearly. I remember the first day I was there in all my smart, my chinos and my quarter zip, and it's slightly too big for me, like my first day at school, and actually looking around and nobody else was really in smart clothes. But I remember sitting down, and I'd gone from school a few months earlier where the people sat next to me, their mums were making their lunches and they didn't really have any independence, to sitting opposite somebody who had a son and was barely making ends meet, and sitting next to a grandmother. And it just felt so foreign to me. I remember asking on the first day whether I could go to the toilet, and it was really unnatural just to be able to get up and go without even asking. And then just the etiquette of the office. What time do you come in? How long do you have to leave it after 5 o'clock to leave, so you don't look like you're just trying to get out the door? Drinks etiquette, I found it really difficult. I didn't make hot drinks for the first month because I needed to look and make sure I knew what the etiquette was about making each other drinks and coffee and tea, because I know that some places it's a normal thing, or this is what I thought. Some places it's not a normal thing. Some people just make it for their team. And luckily, after a month, I was brave enough to start making my own coffee, and luckily none of my team drank coffee and tea, so I was really lucky in that respect. But it was just, it took me a month to do that, just because I was so nervous to get it wrong when you're 18, like fresh out of school. I felt like I didn't have that. I just felt like I was just a fish out of water, and trying to fit in to this foreign world.
So let's just backtrack a tiny bit, because it seems extraordinary that you went through that. And, most of us thinking about it think, gosh, I would hate for someone to join my organisation and that to be happening. So first of all, we're not going to say who it was, but what type of organisation was it? And what was the no onboarding process or anything where things were discussed with you and you were able to be given a clear path of what was expected?
I think so. I was working in accounts in a childcare organisation, so it's a massive multi-million-pound business, and I was very lucky because my boss at the time was 25, so he had more of that experience, and there was onboarding of, this is where the toilets are, this is where the fire exits. But I think the difficulties is all those intangible things, like the drinks etiquette, that you probably struggle to write down on a piece of paper. It's just the norms of a workplace that they probably didn't think about somebody moving in for the first time. There was me and an apprentice, and then everybody else was much older and had been working for 4 or 5 years, so didn't have that. And I don't think they quite realised that, this would, how different it was. You quickly forget. And at the organisation, a lot of people had been there for a long time. So my boss had joined when he was 18. But there wasn't that kind of, the intangible things like the etiquette and things that you don't really want to ask. I remember at 5 o'clock, I was just waiting around, and somebody's like on the first day, because you at school, you're kind of dismissed, and somebody said, you can go, and so it was, I guess it was kind of, they probably didn't realise that I would be nervous and overthink all these things, but that was the case, and I think it's weird because you're expected to be expected to know what you're doing, but also I felt at times that I was infantilised, and I was there a fully full time, and often I was treated like an apprentice, or like somebody younger, or like work experience. So it was like that. It was quite frustrating because I wanted to be treated like an adult, a full-time worker, but I didn't quite feel like that. But when I was treated as somebody who was younger, a kid, then it was quite frustrating. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I really appreciate you being so candid about that, because it's really important for people to put themselves into the shoes of someone like yourself joining the workplace for the first time, and to actually understand what's going through your mind. And, some of the things that are just, that's the accepted way in the workplace. Well, if you've never been in the workplace, you wouldn't know that. And which is why I advocate for bridging the generation gap. The recruitment and onboarding are probably two of the most important aspects of bridging that gap, and having a member of the team join who actually understands what's expected and creates that very positive work-based relationship. Let's move on now to FlipGen and the work that you do there. It sounds very much like, from our previous conversation and from today and everything else, that this is like your natural home to be doing what you're doing. So tell me a little bit more about FlipGen, what it does, who the company is, and what your role is.
Yeah, it is a natural home. I absolutely love it. So we're a youth-led digital wellbeing organisation. So yeah, completely youth-led. There's 4 directors now, 2 young people, 19-year-old me, and 2 people in their 40s who have kids. But we campaign for safety by design, so a digital world that's safe for young people to use and really looks out for their well-being. And also we focus on education. So pretty much we say we have a toolkit where on the website, and we're moving it into and transitioning it into workshops for schools. But basically, with young people, we've developed a toolkit of what we wish we knew when we got a phone. So it's got everything. It's got about 50 pages about phishing, algorithms, all these kind of things. So my job really, we're very much startup. So there's 2 of us working full time. So a bit of everything. But I love kind of coming back to that generational thing. And do I feel like Gen Z? No, because I love politics and I'll watch political sittings and I'll read Hansard and read books. But I love the way that I can hopefully use my experience and be involved with politics without being party political and without all that pressure. So we're campaigning for the changes we want to see, and it's so exciting. Earlier this week, I was at an event in Parliament, walking through Central Lobby, and seeing all the journalists that I watch on TV was just the most exciting thing for me. I was just so giddy. But it's a natural fit as well, because I've mentioned it, but I have OCD and I've really struggled. And often I used to look back at that part of my life and say, like, people always talk about your teenage years and your school years being the best parts of your life. And I used to look back and think, I've just wasted all of this, because I've been in bed, I've been struggling to leave the house. I put my parents through a lot and all these kind of things. So for me, it allows me to look back at that part of my life with real pride and happiness that I went through it, because I know that I wouldn't be working on what I love now if I didn't have it. And it allows me to use that to try and help other people not go through what I went through.
You know what, you talk about the whole digital thing, and you talked about how it impacted you and your mental health. And a massive topic of conversation at the moment is youngsters using mobile phones and social media interaction and so on. And in fact, my guest last week, we were talking about the social media ban in Australia. Where does FlipGen sit with that?
It's a really difficult one, because it's become so divisive in the campaigning space. And we've taken the approach of against a blanket ban, but also against the status quo as it is now. It's very clear that the digital world is harming young people, and something's got to be done about it. But at the same time, we don't believe a blanket ban will be the solution. There's unintended consequences. It push young people into other spaces that are less regulated. The actual definition of social media hasn't actually been decided. And I think there's a lot of research that needs doing on social media and the harms and the way those harms can be mitigated. And also, I think when you talk about generations, and a lot of the people advocating have not grown up in advocating for a ban. Have not grown up in a time of social media, and social media has fundamentally changed young people's lives, but also a reliance on social media has come about because of a lack of third spaces, a lack of safety. You can't really go out and knock on your friend's door and play football in the cul-de-sac anymore because it's just not the culture, and there's safety concerns, and a lack of third space and a lack of community spaces means that a lot of the connection people have is now on social media. And therefore, if we removed social media for young people, I think young people will still be using phones. They'll just use them differently. I think that's what some of the research from Australia is starting to suggest. And also, I'm concerned that if it looks like the tide might be going that way, what are we putting in place for young people away from their screens, outside? What can young people be doing instead of going on social media? And I don't see that we're replacing it with anything. So, yeah, we're advocating for safety by design, education for young people, some age limit, so AI companion bots. I don't think there's any reason why an under 16 should be using them. Algorithmic features, infinite scroll need to be controlled. But actually, we're kind of in that middle ground of against the status quo, but also against an outright ban, and away from my FlipGen work, my mental health work. I really want to see those third spaces back, and physical and places where young people can go and socialize safely, as well, if this ban comes in place.
It's a challenge, isn't it? Because if we have moved on culturally, how do we recreate something that was very natural to generations before yours? And, I'm sure you're familiar with the work of Jonathan Haidt, who talks a lot about the anxious generation and, what is called often the overparenting in the real world and underparenting in the digital world. And this fear of, we don't go on the street because it's dangerous is actually something that's in our minds rather than, the statistics don't bear that out. But as you said, it's cultural. We've got out of the habit of doing that. So it's great to hear your programs are looking at that and looking at ways to engage young people. What about parents? Where do they fit into your work in terms of how they can help their children?
It's parents are absolutely fundamental to the work. I think a lot of the issue is that when you grow up, and traditionally you look for your parents for guidance, your parents, when you're really young, your parents seem to know all the answers and know what's going on, and they've lived through life. They're kind of the beacon of knowledge. But now with the way social media works, young people are kind of in a position where they know more about social media and the online world and the digital world than their parents do. I know my parents often ask me for advice on social media and on the online world, and that's okay now. I'm 21, but a lot of parents now are asking or know less about the digital world when their kids are 7, 8, 9. And so I think it's really important that parents also have the chance to be educated on the online world. I think that one of the things that we're looking to do as well is get young people. The workshops we're developing is peer-to-peer, so older children teaching younger children about the digital world, but also children and young people teaching parents and adults about the digital world. I think is really important, because how can we expect parents to really understand and to ask the right questions about what their children are doing online if they've never been given the education to do so? And I think it's really important to put a reasonable expectation on parents. There's a big move to smartphone free, or take smartphones away from children. I think some people are quite critical of parents giving children iPads, but it's incredibly difficult now if you're working full-time jobs, you're trying to make ends meet, and iPads are marketed for children and a solution, and maybe it's the only thing that parents can do to keep their children on or keep their children busy and unoccupied and not getting bored. So I think I think it's too blunt to say that parents need to parent better, or we need to take iPads away from children, and kind of put that blame on parents. It's a really difficult balancing act, but the first step is really making sure that parents have the chance to know what's going on online, so they can start those conversations with their children, and understand the answers that come back.
You sound like you have a very pragmatic approach to dealing with something that's really, frankly, quite a complex situation. And of course, it's fast moving, so keeping up with everything. And we haven't even touched on AI and the impact that's going to have on the next generation, Generation Alpha. I want to sort of finish our chat today, but spend a little bit of time on the way that you communicate with different generations, because clearly you're now in business as the campaigns director at FlipGen. You know, you're dealing with people of all different ages. You know, you're looking after and being concerned about youngsters who are still at school, younger Gen Zs and Gen Alphas, but you're also dealing with a lot of older people. You talked earlier on about how when you went into the workplace, you were treated somewhat patronizingly by some people. So what's your strategy to communicate effectively across generations?
It is difficult, and it's something that I'm trying to get my head around, especially when you go to like networking events and you want to seem really serious, and you want older generations to respect you and take you seriously. So I find I always try and overdress and wear smart clothes, and because I think that is one way to be taken seriously. But also I've learned recently to use my youth as to my advantage, because I go to events and I'm usually one of the youngest there by about 20 years. And actually I find it, networking I used to hate, but I'm starting to like it a little bit more, because I feel like I've got that conversation starter, and already there's some kind of interest from the other people's perspective to me, because I'm young and because I'm in the position. So it is a difficult one, because I think that in my head I already have to be have to know my stuff more, be more impressive, have better points, because I'm younger and I want to have that credibility. And I think there's a difficulty, because these organizations want young people for youth engagement, but the young people they want to act very mature and act like they've been working for 20 years. So it's really difficult to balance that. But I think for me, it's about yes, being my authentic self, but also you have to compromise, and you have to understand what other people are looking for, and really play on that. But also sometimes it's about having my cake and eating it, in the fact that using it to my advantage when I want to use it to my advantage, but also knowing sometimes I have to act in a certain way, dress in a certain way to gain that credibility.
Yeah, you know what, and it's a game that all of us have played. I remember when I was in a management role and I was in my 30s, which was considered quite young at that time. And I remember doing exactly the same thing as you. I was dressing up. I wanted to be taken more seriously. So I'm not sure that's something that's necessarily changed, but it's interesting how that you do it, and that's actually, goes across all generations. So I always like to ask this question. So in a sentence, what's the best thing about being Gen Z, and what's the biggest challenge about being Gen Z in from your perspective in what you do?
I think the best thing about being Gen Z is that there's so much going on. It's so exciting that AI, and as you said, AI, I'm living in a time when the next 50 years, I'm going to see the next 50 years play out. And I don't know what's going to happen in the next 5-10 years. So it's cool to know that in the next 50 years, there could be jobs that I have no idea. There's different things, that whatever could happen, will happen. And hopefully I get to be part of that and try and shape, what's going on. And, I think every generation thinks it, but this does seem like a time of enormous change, and whether the world will ever be the same again after AI is really exciting, terrifying, but exciting. I'd say the biggest challenge is kind of fighting that a lot of the stereotypes around young people, around being anxious generation snowflakes, and like sensitive, especially when you are, obviously I am sensitive, I am all these things, but I would say a challenge is gain that credibility when everything being talked about, social media bans, regulation it is all about under 16s and all about my generation. So it's a real challenge to try and get our voice heard and try and be part of those conversations. And it's really frustrating when we're not part of those conversations. So I said the challenge is getting part of those conversations and dealing with it when we're not.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And you often feel that, that sort of strange feeling of, sometimes being like, wow, this is fantastic, and then recognizing the challenges and dealing with other people. And finally, have you got some top tips of how you reckon we could bridge the generation gap better, to deal with some of those challenges that you outlined, the assumptions, the stereotypes? What are some of the things that you reckon we could all do to improve the way that we communicate across generations?
I think number one, just talk. It sounds simple, but actually having a conversation about with people from different generations is so important. I love it, and there's actually so much more in common, and I think that often it comes down to people, not ego, but people think older people think young people have it easy, and younger people think that what do older people know, they've not grown up in this time. But actually a lot of the things that we're going through now have existed in different forms, and we can learn so much from different generations. And kind of on that point, I say it's not a zero-sum game. Just because I think growing up now is really difficult, it doesn't mean growing up 20 years ago wasn't difficult. And just because somebody who maybe grew up in the 1970s when there were strikes and 3-day weeks, even though that was quite difficult, it doesn't mean that growing up now is really easy. And I think that the comparison can be really dangerous and actually take away all the learnings that we can learn from each other. We're one society, and a rising tide lifts all the boats. And if we can work together and really learn from each other, I think it's really beneficial. And it's a state of mind, if you're open to learning from other generations and open to having those conversations, then I think there's so much good that can come out of it. But it's all about being open and not being precious about your generation, and thinking you've got all the answers.
Wow. Very wise words, Paddy. That was perfect. And I think you're absolutely right. And funny enough, a lot of those parallels go in what I talk about when I'm doing keynote speeches or in my book or so on. And actually the topic that you mentioned there, the concept of blame, it's all right for you, I think is a great title for my next book. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today, Paddy. It's been great chatting and to have a real insight into your world. And I wish you and all of your team there at FlipGen, wish you every success and continue doing the great work.
Thank you, Alastair. It's been a real pleasure. I think we could have spoken for a lot longer.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We could have done. Thanks again, Paddy. And thank you for listening. We'll be back again in 2 weeks' time for another episode. But bye for now. The Alastair Greener Generationally Speaking podcast was presented by me, Alastair Greener. It was recorded at Granary Studios and produced by James Jones. Please follow us and leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit generationallyspeaking.co.uk.